The scorching sands of Karbala had barely cooled. The battlefield that witnessed the most painful tragedy in Islamic history was now eerily quiet. Bodies of the martyrs lay without burial, and blood stained the earth like sacred ink. The fragrance of sacrifice hung in the air, carried by the desert winds. Among the few survivors of this calamity was a man whose silence carried the loudest echo of truth, Imam Ali ibn al-Hussain, a.s., known as Zain al-Abidin, the fourth Imam of the Shia Muslims. Born in 38 AH, 658 AD, in Medina, Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., was the son of Imam Hussain ibn Ali, a.s., and Lady Sharbanu, s.a., a noblewoman believed to be of Persian royal lineage. Through both his parents, he inherited the nobility of character, depth of knowledge, and divine light that runs through the lineage of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, pbuh. But what the world saw after Karbala was something that transcended lineage. It was pure sabr, patience, strength, and unwavering connection to Allah. On the 10th of Muharram, 61 AH, as the sun rose on the day of Ashura, Imam Zain al-Abidin, lay on a mat in his tent, burning with fever. His body was weak, trembling from illness, yet his heart was steady. Though he wished to rise and defend his father and the family of the Prophet, pbuh, he was unable to even stand. His tears flowed constantly, not for his own suffering, but for the sight of his family facing certain martyrdom. His father, Imam Hussain, a.s., visited him one last time before heading to the battlefield. "My son," he said softly, placing a trembling hand on his son's fevered head, "you are the Imam after me. Your responsibility is not the sword, but the message. Allah has willed that you survive so you may carry the light forward." Imam Zain al-Abidin, could barely speak through his tears, but he nodded, understanding the burden that was about to be placed on his shoulders. It was not a coincidence that Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., survived Karbala. This was divine design. His illness kept him from battle, and thus from martyrdom. In a world where swords were seen as the only symbol of strength, Allah was about to show that spiritual endurance could be even more powerful than warfare. When the brutal massacre ended, the Umayyad army looted the tents and burned them down. The women and children screamed, searching for each other in the smoke and chaos. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., still unable to walk, was dragged from his bed, chained and shackled by the enemy. Yazid's army showed no mercy, not even to the sick grandson of the Prophet, pbuh. Lady Zainab, s.a., the sister of Imam Hussain, a.s., took charge of the survivors. Her courage was unmatched, and her devotion to her nephew, Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., was a lifeline for him. Together, they carried the message of Karbala beyond the battlefield. The prisoners, women, children, and the sick Imam, were forced to walk hundreds of miles from Karbala to Kufa, and then to Damascus, the capital of the tyrant Yazid ibn Muawiyah. All along the journey, Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., though weak in body, was strong in soul. He watched as the heads of his father, uncles, brothers, and companions were raised on spears. He listened to the insults hurled at his family. And still, he did not curse, he did not cry out in hate, he prayed. Perhaps the most defining moment of Part 1 comes in the court of Yazid. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., stood, thin and shackled, before a throne of corruption. The tyrant mocked the family of the Prophet, pbuh, and paraded them as if they were criminals. But Yazid made a grave mistake. He allowed Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., to speak. With a voice that shook hearts, the Imam began his sermon. "O people! I am the son of Mecca and Mina. I am the son of Zamzam and Safa. I am the son of Muhammad al-Mustafa, pbuh. I am the son of Ali al-Murtada, a.s., the son of Fatima al-Zahra, s.a., the son of Khadija al-Kubra, s.a." One by one, he recited his noble lineage, reminding everyone in that court, these are not rebels, these are the family of the Prophet, pbuh. The crowd, once silent or mocking, began to weep. The atmosphere changed. Yazid panicked and ordered the adhan, call to prayer, to be recited, hoping to silence the Imam. But when the muezzin reached, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, Imam Zain al-Abidin, turned to Yazid and said, O Yazid! Is Muhammad, pbuh, your grandfather or mine? If you claim he is yours, you lie. And if you admit he is mine, then why have you done this to his family? This was not just courage, it was divine wisdom. Imam Zain al-Abidin, spoke truth in the face of a tyrant, without raising a weapon. His words were his resistance, and they pierced harder than any blade. After months of captivity, the family of the Prophet, pbuh, was finally released. They returned to Medina, not as victors in the worldly sense, but as the bearers of the heaviest legacy. The people of Medina wept when they saw what remained of the household of the Prophet, pbuh. Imam Zain al-Abidin, though free from chains, carried invisible chains of grief, the trauma of Karbala, the burden of Imamate, and the responsibility to guide an ummah that had strayed. He did not seek revenge. He did not call for war. Instead, he turned inward, toward du'as, worship, and education. He cried often, not for himself, but for his father and the companions who were martyred. His tears were a form of remembrance, not weakness. He became known as Zain al-Abidin, the ornament of the worshippers, and al-Sajjad, the one who prostrates often. Every scar in his life became a source of closeness to Allah. In a time when political opposition meant death, Imam Zain al-Abidin, began a silent revolution, one built on spiritual awakening, education, and remembrance of Karbala. He compiled his prayers into what we now know as the Sahifa Sajidiyya, often called the Psalms of Islam. These were no ordinary du'as, they were deep, poetic, profound conversations with Allah, covering every emotion from gratitude to grief, from love to social justice. One prayer would teach manners, another would teach political awareness. One would cry over the orphans of Karbala, another would call for the care of the oppressed. Each supplication was a lesson. And in these lessons, the Imam built a fortress around the true Islam, one that Yazid could never penetrate. Imam Zain al-Abidin, lived in a time when truth was dangerous and silence was survival. But he balanced both. He was silent in protest, but loud in devotion. He did not raise a sword, but he raised the souls of thousands. He did not destroy palaces, but he built hearts. His life was one of endurance, but never defeat. He lived through the worst tragedy imaginable and came out not bitter, but better. He taught that true strength is not in how many battles you win, but in how deeply you submit to Allah during suffering. The blood of Karbala had long soaked into the sands, but its message had just begun to blossom in the hearts of the believers. The sword had done its damage. Now, the burden of truth and the revival of true Islam rested on the fragile shoulders of a man who carried within him both unbearable sorrow and unmatched devotion. Imam Zain al-Abidin, the fourth Imam of the Shia, chose a path unlike any warrior before him. He did not lift a sword, yet he led a resistance so powerful that it threatened the very foundations of Yazid's empire. He would fight, but with worship, with du'as, with tears, and with patience. Returning to Medina after the tragedy of Karbala, Imam Zain al-Abidin, did not retreat into silence. Instead, he became a spiritual beacon in a world clouded by tyranny and moral decay. In a time where Yazid's rule manipulated religion for political gain, the Imam's life was a living testimony to the purity of Islam. His days were filled with acts of service to others. His nights were illuminated by the light of tahajjud, night prayer, whispered supplications, and long prostrations that lasted until dawn. It was said that the Imam's forehead, knees, and hands were marked with the scars of constant sujud. That is why he was called al-Sajjad, the one who prostrates often. To outsiders, this may have seemed like personal worship. But for those who understood, every sajda was a form of protest. Every tear was a refusal to forget Karbala. Every whispered prayer was louder than any battle cry. Though he was freed from the physical chains of Yazid's prison, Imam Zain al-Abidin, A.S., was never free from the chains of grief. Karbala was etched into his soul. He carried its memories in every heartbeat. Whenever food or water was placed before him, he wept. When people spoke of bravery, he remembered the children of the Ahl-e-Bait thirsting under the desert sun. When he heard the adhan, he remembered how Yazid tried to silence him with the very call to prayer that bore witness to his grandfather, the Prophet Muhammad, Pbuh. Once, a servant brought water to the Imam. As he took the bowl in his hands, he paused. His eyes filled with tears. "How can I drink," he said softly, "when the grandson of the Prophet, Pbuh, my father, died thirsty on the plains of Karbala?" And he set the bowl aside. People often misunderstood this pain. Some said he wept too much. Others feared that his constant remembrance would incite rebellion. But Imam Zain al-Abidin, A.S., was planting something deeper than revolt. He was cultivating remembrance. He was ensuring that the truth of Karbala would never be forgotten. In a time when public speeches against the Umayyads could lead to death, Imam Zain al-Abidin, A.S., turned to the most powerful tool he had, the dua. He began compiling a series of prayers so beautiful, so deep, and so layered with meaning that they would become known as Sahifa Sajidiyya, the Psalms of Islam. This collection was more than just spiritual whispers, it was a roadmap for humanity. Each dua was carefully crafted. They were written in the language of worship, but beneath the surface, they taught values of justice, humility, gratitude, moral reform, care for the poor, and the true essence of leadership. Some of the most powerful examples include Dua Makarim al-Akhlaq, a prayer that teaches noble character, humility, and how to deal with both friends and enemies with dignity. Dua for the people of the front lines, a deep expression of care and support for those who defend truth and justice. Dua for parents, a moving reminder of the rights and status of parents, showing Islam's strong emphasis on family and gratitude. Dua in the morning and evening, a guide to living a life of mindfulness, connected to Allah in every moment of the day. But one of the most moving du'as is the Dua Abu Hamza Thumalai, recited in the nights of Ramadan. In it, the Imam pours his heart to Allah, admitting his flaws with unmatched honesty, begging for mercy with the humility of a true servant. These were not just spiritual texts. They were a revolution in disguise. In every line, the Imam reminded the people of what Islam truly was, and what it was not. The Muslims of the time were in crisis. The memory of the Prophet, Pbuh, was being erased by the politics of the Caliphate. The people feared truth. They were silenced by force and distracted by worldly pleasures. The Umayyad regime had invested in turning the Islamic Empire into a dynasty built on fear and materialism. But Imam Zain al-Abidin, A.S., quietly worked against this. He rebuilt the broken connection between the people and Allah. He revived their sense of justice and compassion. He taught through actions, not slogans. In the dark hours of the night, he would carry food on his back and deliver it to the homes of the needy in secret. Many of those who received the food never knew it was from the Imam, until after his death, when the nightly charity suddenly stopped. Only then did they realize the identity of their silent helper. This was his way. Silent. Constant. Unshakable. He also supported and trained scholars, narrated hadith from his father and grandfather, and passed on the knowledge of the Prophet's household to a new generation. Despite being under constant surveillance, he managed to keep the lamp of knowledge burning. Imam Zain al-Abidin, A.S., lived under the rule of three tyrants, Yazid, Muawiyah II, and Marwan ibn Hakam, all of whom feared his influence. While they had armies, palaces, and wealth, the Imam had the hearts of the believers. The rulers feared him not because of what he said publicly, but because of what he represented, the living truth of Islam. They tried to silence him, but how can you silence a man whose every prostration calls the people back to justice? Once, Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik went for Hajj and found the Kaaba crowded. No one made way for him. But when Imam Zain al-Abidin a.s. entered, the crowd parted with respect and awe. Hisham pretended not to know him. A poet, Farazdak, stood up and recited lines in the Imam's honor. "This is the son of Fatima, if you do not know him. The prophets of God end with his grandfather. His footprint is known to the soil of Mecca. The Kaaba knows him, and so does the sacred sanctuary." Hisham was furious and imprisoned the poet, but the words had already reached the hearts of the people. The truth could not be chained. Imam Zain al-Abidin a.s. lived for around 34 years after Karbala, dedicating his entire life to preserving the values for which his father was martyred. His was not a loud revolution, but it was a lasting one. He taught that du'as were not weakness, they were power. That patience was not silence, it was wisdom. That true leadership was not domination, it was servitude to God and compassion for creation. His legacy can be felt even today. His supplications continue to guide Muslims around the world. His life proves that sometimes, the greatest warriors don't carry swords, they carry faith. The battlefield of Karbala had left a permanent scar upon the body of Islam. The Umayyads believed they had extinguished the light of the Prophet's family, silenced their message, and erased their legacy from memory. But they had underestimated the strength of a soul shaped by divine connection and the fire of sorrow. In the wake of destruction, Imam Zain al-Abidin a.s. emerged, not with armies or swords, but with knowledge, patience, and unwavering dedication to truth. He became the torchbearer of the Prophet's legacy, the quiet yet undeniable proof that truth cannot be silenced. Though broken physically and burdened emotionally, the Imam stood tall spiritually. His strength radiated through the intellectual and moral revival he led in Medina, protecting the essence of Islam from being buried beneath political corruption. Every action of Imam Zain al-Abidin a.s. was a reflection of his grandfather, the Prophet Muhammad, pbuh. His conduct, both public and private, was so noble and elevated that even his enemies were left speechless. His humility was not weakness, it was strength rooted in awareness of Allah. His patience was not passivity, it was a deep reliance on divine timing. And his silence was not fear, it was wisdom crafted in the fire of trial. One of his famous qualities was his refusal to publicly curse or verbally attack the enemies of Ahl-e-Bait as. He chose instead to respond with truth, piety, and character. He knew that his actions would be remembered longer than any speech. After Karbala, the political environment was hostile. Surveillance of the Imam was constant. Espionage, manipulation, and suppression were all strategies employed by the ruling Umayyads to silence him. But the Imam was strategic and careful. He knew that fighting with the sword would lead to further bloodshed. Instead, he launched a silent revolution through education and spiritual revival. He gathered students, nurtured scholars, and became the unseen force behind a growing network of knowledge bearers. Many of the hadiths of the Prophet, pbuh, were preserved and passed on through him. He shared what he had inherited from his father Imam Hussain as., his uncle Imam Hassan as., and his grandfather Imam Ali as. In doing so, he revived the true teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, pbuh, which had been distorted by political powers. His teaching focused on three core areas. Tawheed, oneness of God, restoring the understanding of Allah's justice, mercy, and closeness. Akhlaq, ethics and manners, teaching character through his own example. Wilaya, spiritual authority, reminding people, subtly and wisely, that true leadership lies with the Ahl-e-Bait as., not corrupt dynasties. Imam Zain al-Abidin as. was not just a teacher, he was a mentor of spiritual giants. Under his guidance emerged several key figures who would later help shape Islamic thought and preserve the message of Ahl-e-Bait as. One of his most notable students was Abu Hamza Thumalai, the narrator of the beautiful supplication known as Dua Abu Hamza Thumalai. This powerful dua reveals the depth of the Imam's connection with Allah and became a foundational spiritual text for future generations. Another key student was Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, a.s., his own son and the fifth Imam. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., raised his son not just as a father, but as a spiritual leader who would carry the torch forward. Imam al-Baqir, as, later became known for opening new doors of Islamic knowledge and deeper Quranic interpretation. Thus, the chain of divine leadership remained unbroken, and each Imam inherited not just the knowledge of the previous one, but the spiritual and moral burden of preserving the true Islam. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., ensured that the tragedy of Karbala would never fade into silence. While he did not speak of it openly in public sermons, he kept the memory alive in his du'as, his tears, and his personal conversations. He used grief as a weapon of remembrance. He wept for 34 years, until his death, whenever food or water was brought before him. He organized gatherings of mourning, teaching others how to grieve with purpose. He encouraged his companions to write poetry about Karbala, a tradition that has now lived for over 1,400 years in the form of Marsiya and Noha. Even the simple act of telling the story of Karbala became a form of resistance, a direct challenge to the lies spread by the Umayyad regime. The Imam wanted the world to remember not only the pain, but the principles for which his father and family sacrificed their lives: truth, dignity, justice, and love of Allah. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., lived through some of the most corrupt reigns in Islamic history. The caliphs who ruled during his time were often tyrannical, self-serving, and spiritually bankrupt. Among them, Yazid ibn Muawiyah, the murderer of Imam Hussain, a.s., infamous for his open sin and disrespect for Islam. Marwan ibn al-Hakam, known for his cruelty and his hatred of the Ahl-e-Bait. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, a ruthless caliph who focused on power consolidation, crushing opponents, and rewriting history. Yet none of them could match the quiet influence of Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s. Wherever he went, people were drawn to his presence. Even enemies admitted his nobility. His dignity was undeniable. His prayers touched the hardest hearts. One story from history speaks volumes. Once, a man insulted the Imam in public. The people expected the Imam to respond in anger. But instead, the Imam said, "If what you say about me is true, I ask Allah to forgive me. And if it is false, then I ask Allah to forgive you." The man was stunned. He wept. He begged for forgiveness and fell at the Imam's feet. This was the power of moral victory. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., was deeply aware of the divisions within the Muslim Ummah. He saw how sectarianism was being used to break the people apart and distract them from their real oppressors. Yet, he never compromised the truth of the path of the Ahl-e-Bait, a.s. He walked a careful path, uniting the Muslims through ethics, compassion, and worship, but always standing firm on the principles of divine leadership and truth. He never bowed to political power, nor did he accept the legitimacy of tyrants. He taught that the path of the Ahl-e-Bait was not one of political gain, but one of spiritual salvation. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., lived until the age of 57. It is widely narrated in Shia tradition that he was poisoned by the Umayyad ruler al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik, a final act of fear by a corrupt regime that could no longer tolerate his influence. His martyrdom was silent, like much of his life, but it left behind a roar of legacy. He was buried in the Jannat al-Baqi cemetery in Medina, beside his uncle Imam Hassan, a.s., his beloved father Imam Hussain, a.s., and his great-grandmother Fatima bint Asad. His impact only grew stronger after his passing. Sahifa Sajidiyya continues to be read and studied by millions, offering guidance in every age. His life remains a blueprint for resistance through piety and patience. His memory is honored every year during Majalis-e-Azah, mourning gatherings, around the world. And most importantly, the mission he began was carried forward by his son, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, a.s., and then by Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, a.s., who built the foundation for the Jafari school of thought. Imam Zain al-Abidin, did not lead armies. He did not overthrow empires with weapons. But he planted seeds of truth in the hearts of people, and these seeds grew into forests of resistance, remembrance, and revival. He proved that worship can be revolution. Du'as can shake thrones. Patience is not surrender, it is victory waiting to bloom. He gave the world a new way to fight evil, not through violence, but through values. The world tried to forget Karbala. The caliphs buried history under gold, palaces, and power. They hoped silence would erase the screams of injustice, and time would bury the truth. But they did not understand the will of Allah or the power of hearts shaped by divine love. They did not understand Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s. Though his life ended in silence, his legacy roared across centuries. In every tear of a mourner, every whispered dua in the stillness of night, every stand for justice, and every act of faith under oppression, his soul lives on. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., carried the aftermath of Karbala like no one else. He was not just a survivor, he was the soul of that tragedy. Every moment of his life after that massacre was lived in remembrance. Every prayer carried the pain of watching his father, uncles, brothers, cousins, and companions martyred. Every breath he took was a challenge to the tyrants who tried to bury the message of Imam Hussain, a.s. He didn't raise a sword, but he defeated empires through character, knowledge, and patience. He didn't climb a pulpit, but he taught the world how to speak to Allah. One of the Imam's greatest gifts to humanity is the Sahifa Sajidiyya, a book of supplications, whispered from a wounded heart, rising like arrows of light into the heavens. Often called the Psalms of Islam, the Sahifa contains over 50 deeply spiritual du'as, covering everything from gratitude and praise of Allah, repentance and seeking forgiveness, social justice and helping the oppressed, prayers for parents, neighbors, the poor, and even enemies, emotional healing, discipline, and control of desires, supplication for strength in times of trial. This book is not only a spiritual masterpiece, it is a manual for transformation. It teaches believers how to navigate hardship, how to purify the soul, and how to stay connected to Allah even when surrounded by injustice. In a time where even speaking the truth could result in death, Imam Zain al-Abidin, poured revolution into words of devotion. This was his jihad. In the years following Karbala, the Muslim world had grown dark. The Umayyads ruled with iron fists, and Islam was being used as a tool for power, not a path to Allah. The people were confused, divided, and spiritually starved. Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., responded not with anger, but with reconstruction, rebuilding the Ummah from the inside out. He created circles of knowledge in Medina, taught both the elite and the poor, mentored scholars, and reminded the people of their worth in the eyes of Allah, not in the court of a king. And his approach worked. Many who had once been silent began to speak. Many who had once accepted tyranny began to question it. The people who had been asleep began to wake up. Imam Zain al-Abidin, acted as a bridge between two generations of resistance. He kept the message of Karbala alive and prepared the ground for the intellectual revolution that would come through his son, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, a.s., and later his grandson, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, a.s. He made it clear that Karbala was not an end, it was a beginning. He gave the world a spiritual structure to hold on to when times get dark, a clear path to follow when truth is under attack, and an unshakable belief that Allah's justice will always prevail, even if it takes time. Today, over 1,400 years later, the influence of Imam Zain al-Abidin, a.s., is still alive. His du'as are recited every Ramadan, especially in the nights of Qadr, guiding believers in heartfelt repentance. The Sahifa Sajidiyya is taught in seminaries, read in universities, and studied in both East and West. In places like Iraq, Iran, India, Pakistan, Lebanon, the United States, and Europe, his name is spoken with honor, especially by those who fight for the oppressed and speak truth to power. Human rights activists and scholars of ethics often cite his prayers for social justice and the dignity of all people, regardless of race, class, or religion. His silent revolution has become a timeless movement. For youth facing peer pressure, identity confusion, or spiritual disconnection, Imam Zain Abidin, A.S., teaches that you can be surrounded by wrong and still remain right. You can lose everything, yet stay loyal to your truth. You can be wounded, but still be the healer of others. For adults struggling with grief, pain, or injustice, he is proof that even the deepest wounds can be transformed into light. For leaders, educators, and parents, his life shows that teaching through character, not just words, leaves a legacy no empire can erase. And for the oppressed, his survival after Karbala, his patience in chains, his dignity in the face of Yazid, offer the ultimate reassurance: Allah never abandons the oppressed. In 95 AH, 713 CE, Imam Zain al-Abidin, A.S., was martyred, according to many reports, poisoned by al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik. His body was laid to rest in Jannat al-Baqi, but his soul rose beyond time. He left behind not just a family or a following, but a philosophy, a path, and a legacy so powerful that no sword could destroy it. His grave may be modest, surrounded by the ruins of history, but his light remains eternal. From Medina to Michigan, from Karbala to California, his voice whispers to all those seeking peace, purpose, and purity. He teaches us to remain silent when words are weapons, but speak when truth needs a voice. To bow only to Allah, never to tyrants. To let our du'as be louder than our complaints. To turn our grief into guidance. And to always remember, true strength is silent, but it shakes the world. Imam Zain al-Abidin, as, walked through the ashes of Karbala not with vengeance, but with vision. He showed us that faith is not just in rituals or titles, it is in how we treat others, how we speak to our Lord, and how we carry our pain. He may not have ruled a city, but he ruled hearts. He may not have stood on a throne, but he stood before Allah, humbled, broken, but undefeated. And in that, he became a symbol of something far greater than power. He became a symbol of truth wrapped in patience, faith wrapped in fire. Today, millions say his name in prayers, weep in his remembrance, and walk his path of devotion. And so, the silent strength that followed Karbala lives on forever.